Good morning, all your beautiful people. I'm so happy to see that the numbers of the people joining this webinar is climbing, that we are now already at around 140 participants. I know there's a few more that have registered and will be joining us within the next minute or two. But I think in the interest of time, I would like us to start. I want to say thank you to the panel members and all the attendees for taking the time out to join us in this important session of the PSTF. And without wasting any more time, I'm going to ask our Deputy Director General for Learning and Professional Development, Dilem Ponazi, to do the opening and welcome. And I also want to just, on her behalf, inform you that she has got other commitments. She has graciously allowed 10 minutes of her time to open this meeting for us, or the session for us. So we're going to start with her, then she is going to excuse herself, and then we will move on with the rest of the program. Thank you so much. Over to you, Chi.
Good morning. Thank you so much, Saraya. So nice to have this interaction. It's exciting to be here on the 23rd Public Sector Training Forum webinar series. We know this is not the normal way that we normally meet, but these are the issues that we've had because of COVID, but we're happy that we still can meet together and have these very important discussions and share knowledge, share some views, and making sure that we're all empowered. So we want to welcome you, and we hope that you will continue to attend the 2 days. So the webinar series is over 2 days, and there are different themes per day. So it's not a repeat of the same thing. It's different on each day. So the theme for this webinar is professionalization of the public sector, starting the conversation. And the reason why we want to start the conversation is because you are the people that are involved in this work that we have to do. So we want to speak with you, have a conversation with you on unpacking the professionalization framework, talk to the issues that we pick up there, what are the implications, how do we start implementing what we need to do, and how do we help each other as a community to do this, making sure that the public sector is capacitated and is professional in the way that it's doing its work. Tomorrow is also exciting. So today's themes, as I said, is outcomes and impacts of ETD professional and professionalization interventions in the public sector. What do we measure around this? And we've got exciting speakers that will be speaking to us, and I hope you learn from them and ask them lots of questions, because they are here to not only present, but to have a conversation with you. So I hope that you will continue with the conversation, and tomorrow we'll be focusing more on the ICT areas around these issues, knowing that if we look at today, the PSTF is normally an in-person conference over 3 days where we sit around the table and we get to see each other after a long time. But this time around, we're using the IT platform to be able to meet together and discuss. So we hope that will be enriching, and we hope soon we'll be back to the in-face interaction of the PSTF, but we can only do that when we have this conversation and we get feedback from you around how you experience these kind of webinars, and how we move forward together in making sure that we improve the landscape that we work with. I wish you all the best in the 2 days, and I hope that you'll enjoy the conversation and come out with a lot that you would have learned. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for starting us off on this morning's discussions. We appreciate you joining us, and have a wonderful day for the rest of the day. Thank you, CDG. Right, so I want to just start off by taking you through a summary of the program. So DDG has already given you an overview of what our themes are for today and tomorrow. So today we're going to talk about professionalization and the interventions and how do we measure that. And then tomorrow we're going to focus a little bit more on the ICT aspect of professionalization and how we can use ICT to support ETD delivery. On the next slide, I'm just going to briefly run through today's program. So we've had the opening and welcome. Then as part of our keynote address, Professor Matrin Mule, who we can always count on to be available when we have such sessions. Thank you for that, Prof. We'll be talking towards the national framework. Then Dr. Bochabela Marcha is not able to join us, but on his behalf, Ms. Faith Nyaka is standing in, and she will be taking us through the implications of the framework for ETD interventions. Then around 10 o'clock, we will be going to a Q&A session. And just for you to note that the only way that you will be able to interact with the panel is to use the Q&A function that you can find at the bottom of your screen. So you can type your questions there as they come up and as speakers are talking. And then during this session, we will take some time to just revert back to your questions and have a discussion on the issues that were raised. Then after the first question and answer session, next slide, please. We are going to have a speaker, Jos Wassen from Maastricht University. Dr. Wassen has also graciously agreed to address us on the issue of measuring the outcome of intervention. Then we have Alana Baker on the futures of proof of government. Stephen Meaty from the Western Cape Academy is going to touch on the repositioning of academies. Then again, we'll have a question and answer session. And then to close off the proceedings of the morning, Dr. Denise Miller will take us through the ETD professionalization framework and the implications for implementation. Thank you, Marty. You can stop sharing. Just a few other housekeeping session arrangements, is I mentioned that you must please use the Q&A function to interact with the panel that you can find at the bottom of the screen. We were hoping to stream the session live onto YouTube, but we are having some technical challenges around that. But we are recording the session. So by the latest on Monday, you will receive an emailed link for everyone that has registered. You will receive a link. On that link, there will be a reference to the recording, and we will also be sharing all the presentations and papers that are being discussed here today, so that you can access it and you can then download it for your own report. So first on the program, allow me to introduce Professor Matrin Mule. He's the Executive Dean at the Tshwane University of Technology's Faculty for Humanities. He led the process to finalize the national framework towards professionalization of public service. He has 20 years of teaching experience in different universities in South Africa, and he's also an experienced researcher. His areas of interest include historiography, ontology, and epistemology of public administration. And he likes to focus on issues of developmental state, politics of transition, the Pan-African thought philosophy, and theory of governance. Professor Matrin Mule, thank you for taking the time out to join us this morning, and I'm handing over to you.
Soria, thank you so much for your kind introduction. And also let me start by conveying my gratitude to you for hosting me this evening, and also for inviting us to share our ideas around the whole question of professionalization, which we are all talking about it. And that, of course, is inevitable, because it follows the Cabinet's approval of the national framework for the professionalization of the public sector. I think it was approved on the 19th of October, 2022. And I'm glad that the focus of the framework related to professionalization is on the public sector, not simply the public service. But what is the significance of this? Perhaps that is where I need to start. And fortunately, the answer is simple. The framework applies to the entirety of that part of the economy that it applies to the entirety of that part of the economy that the state controls. And this comprises the administration of the state in all spheres of government, including, of course, those who are at the core phase of service delivery. I'm talking also about your teachers, your nurses, and of course also the framework applies to your state-owned enterprises. With some occupations in the public sector, which have a long history of having organized themselves as professions, the framework is not intended to interfere with those arrangements, but to complement them by emphasizing something which is critically important, the public good as the basis for the professionalization of the public sector. And this is what distinguishes the public sector from the private sector. We all know that the public sector exists for the public good, not the bottom line. And I like how the British professor Ian McLean conceptualized the public good. And this is what he says. He says that the public good is any good that, if supplied to anybody, is necessarily supplied to everybody, and from whose benefits it is impossible or impracticable to exclude anybody. Ladies and gentlemen, this is where the philosophy behind the professionalization of the public sector lies. The commitment to always act, in other ways, an attempt to institutionalize a sense of commitment to always act in the public interest and satisfy all aspects of human life. And the only measure of whether are we succeeding in that pursuit or not ought to be the state of citizens' happiness. It is because of this that in the framework, professionalization of the public sector is conceptualized as the commitment to institutionalize capability within the state, including the ethical disposition, where public administration norms and standards should shape our habits and practices. And this is key for optimizing this notion of the public good, which is the backbone of what we seek to achieve through the professionalization of the public service. A professional public sector is conscious of ethical impulses and moral vision of democracy. Again, this is what the framework seeks to achieve as a key imperative of statecraft. It gives effect to what it always, it gives effect to what we always wanted as the post-apartheid public sector to be. And this dates back to the country's very foundation of its democracy. Perhaps to have a deeper understanding of why are we professionalizing? Why are we doing what we are doing? Let's go back a bit to history. Remember, in the early 90s, a very important promise was made during the multi-party negotiation processes. It was said that as we were trying to imagine the future South Africa. It was said that there shall be efficient, non-partisan, career-orientated public service broadly representative of the South African community, functioning on a basis of fairness, and which shall serve all members of the public in an unbiased and impartial manner, and shall, in the exercise of its power and in compliance with its duties, loyally execute the lawful policies of the government of the day in the performance of its administrative functions, close quote. Of course, this was one of the 34 principles that the political parties which had negotiated South Africa's transition from apartheid to democracy had forged a consensus on in the early 90s, when the intention was to seal the country's ties with destiny. It shaped the provision of the 1996 Constitution, especially those which relate to the basic values and principles of public administration. Of course, one of these norms and values is that employment and personnel management practices should be based on ability, objectivity, fairness, and the need to redress the imbalances of the past to achieve representation. All these enjoin that the public sector should be institutionalized as a profession. It should embrace the merit principle, and it should espouse the values of probity, neutrality, and fairness. This encapsulates the essence of professionalism. You'll also recall that in those days, there was the Presidential Review Commission on the Transformation and Reform of the Public Service, which the former President Nelson Mandela had set up. It was in 1996. It was chaired by Professor Vincent Mapai. That commission was set up to advise President Mandela about the type of the public service required to drive the democratic system of government. And indeed, the report of the commission emphasized the importance of the professionalization of the public service. And when you look at our constitution and try to compare it with many other constitutions, you realize that South Africa's constitution is even more emphatic on professionalizing the public service or the public sector in general, including various pieces of legislation and policy objectives. And key among these, of course, is the people-first approach to governance. What we often call a Batho-Bele approach to public service delivery. But almost 2 decades later, since the inception of the democratic dispensation, we had another important initiative in this country in the form of the National Development Plan. We all know the National Development Plan had mapped the country as future as the blueprint for socio-economic transformation. The NDP intimated emphatically the necessity to professionalize the public service as a key imperative for building state capacity and institutional capability. I am making reference to this history to make a point that the framework for the professionalization of the public sector, which the cabinet has approved last year, is a consummation of a long journey towards the ideal public administration, which, however, had been fraught with lapses and contradictions. And we need to talk about those lapses and contradictions, because it is only in that way that we could actually learn from what went wrong in the past, so that we should not commit the same mistake as we get up to the implementation of the framework. You'll recall, ladies and gentlemen, that our constitution was adopted by the Constitutional Assembly. I think it was on the 11th of October, 1996. It was signed into law by President Mandela on the 10th of December, 1996, and it came into effect on the 4th of February, 1997. Its prescription of the values and principles governing public administration as the normative basis for the professionalization of the public sector, however, could only be written into a legislation in 2014 in a piece of legislation called Public Administration Management Act. Why am I saying this? I want to demonstrate that it took almost 2 decades for the basic values and principles of public administration to be written into a legislation. The NDP, secondly, the NDP was accepted by almost all parties in Parliament in 2012. Initiatives to amend the existing legislative framework to incorporate recommendation of the NDP on building state capacity and institution capability, where professionalizing the public service was emphasized as one of the key imperatives to achieve this, only started in 2021. And some of these pieces of legislation are yet to conclude. And this is 10 years since the NDP's adoption. And coupled to all this were the Presidential Review Commission's recommendation made in as early as 1998, where key among them was that meritocracy should be a guiding norm in staffing practices in the public sector. But how can these lapses and delays be explained? Once more, I'm asking this question because as we gear up for the implementation of the framework, we should understand, and this is a point that I made earlier, we should understand what had gone wrong in the past in the attempt to pursue similar endeavors. Perhaps the answer is simple. South Africa does not lack great ideas, but the agency to see them through. I am saying this, ladies and gentlemen, to make it the point that we need to act with a sense of speed in terms of implementing the framework on the professionalization of the public sector. That is very important. And the importance of this is even underscored by the fact that we are reeling from the aftermath of COVID-19 pandemic, and coupled with the energy crisis, amid certain socioeconomic challenges of poverty, unemployment, and inequality, which have spawned public discontent. Building state capacity to institutionalize the capability required to navigate this complexity has never been more urgent. And professionalizing the public service is a means to this. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, the point that I'm trying to make is that we cannot afford to snag and obfuscate on the task of professionalizing the public sector any longer. The pledge about this had long been inscripted in the foundation of South Africa's democracy. It has subsequently been reiterated in the Constitution and entreated in the NDP. The framework, therefore, is a response to all this. Its 5-pillar approach, which Faith will take us through, to professionalization emphasizes the following: recruitment, selection, induction, onboarding, planning, and performance management, continuous learning and professional development, including managing career progression and incidents. All these are interlinked, and meritocracy is the cross-cutting principle. Professionalizing the public sector is key in ensuring that the state has in its employed qualified employees with a sense of public service and the conscientiousness to perform the public function, including, more importantly, their ethical disposition, which need to be steeped in the Vatopele principle. Looking closely at the framework, and this is key as we work towards implementing the framework. Looking closely at the framework, it is clear that its success depends largely on the contribution of education, training, and development sector. And therefore, I am glad that this discussion is actually taking place in the education and training development platform. And here, I am also, ladies and gentlemen, talking particularly about as well the post-school education system, such as your universities and training academies, such as yourself, the National School of Government and professional associations. And also, I am talking particularly about the Public Service Sector Education and Training Authority and the Local Government Sector Education and Training Authority. These are the sources of what we call talent pipeline, and are key to us, once more, the implementation of the framework. The post-school education system, we all know that it exists to create knowledge and equip students with competencies and skills, while Sector Education and Training Authority leads in the development of skilled and competent workforce for the public sector. And it is in this intersection of missions where the strategic necessity for partnership to expand the production of highly skilled professionals and enhance the innovative capacity of the nation lies. It is because of this, ladies and gentlemen, that the framework emphasizes the importance of partnership between the post-school sector, education and training development sector, and professional association, including government itself. It regards this as a strategic imperative of particularly the epoch where technology, which has been gathering pace for years, has now gone into override and is consistent with emerging trends where traditional images of universities as self-contained autonomous institutions are being displayed by the growing numbers of them working in multiple partnerships with external organizations. And the importance of this in building state capacity cannot be overemphasized. I'm saying all this, ladies and gentlemen, to also make a point that government is not the cause for talent pipeline problem, but it experienced the brunt of its effect. Academia, government, PSTF, LGCTA collaboration, including yourself, is therefore critically important to influence the source of talent pipeline, especially as it relates to re-educating and reskilling the workforce. Related to this is the sequencing of academic curricula for students of government studies. In other words, in our curricula, We need to think about modules and pedagogical approaches which train students to be thinkers, not just specialists. And this is important to hone their analytical skills. And also, there is the epistemic question of the discipline itself, where in various instances, and this point we've been making consistently, where in various instances, our teaching in the field of public administration, in many instances, still appear to be stuck in the shibboleths of the new public management framework, where students are taught business principles to run government as a business. This logic needs to change. We need to frame our programs in a way which seeks to institutionalize humanitarian public service, where the following virtues are underscored as part of their philosophical orientation: compassion, caring, humanness, sharing, respect. In other words, an important instruction to students of public affairs, public administration, ought to be that, to use the words of two American authors, Den Hart and Den Hart, they say that government should not be run like a business. It should be run like a democracy. And this is the philosophical orientation that should frame our approach in terms of teaching public administration students, in terms of packaging our training and development intervention. We need to get our philosophical orientation right. We need to get our sense of a commitment to the public service right, because these are the key imperatives required for us to succeed in our effort to professionalize the public service. Soria, perhaps let me end here. And I'm glad that you will still also tomorrow talk about ICT, the technology and public service, in terms of how it also relates to the professionalization of the public service. But thank you so much for inviting us to be part of this conversation. Thank you so much, Soria.
Thank you so much, Prof. Matharimule, for that introductory overview of what the intention behind the professionalization framework is. I know a lot of thought went into it, a lot of work, a lot of consultation. I'm going to, maybe before I hand over to Faith to take us through the next item, just alert you to the fact that I have posted in the chat function the final document, so the final professionalization framework in booklet form in PDF that you can access and download. We will include it in the document. There have been some questions around whether the presentations will be shared. For those people who might have missed the initial announcement, we will be sending out a link on Monday where the recording of this session will be posted and available to you for download from YouTube. And we will also be sharing all the presentations and the document with you as well. I have also noted that we have sorted out the live streaming to YouTube. So that is now also a session that you can view on YouTube if you are struggling to stay online currently, and it will also be available for your viewing beyond this session. So then I would like to, I've noted the questions, but I think we will deal with them after the session. Prof, can I just stick with you? I know that you also have a time crunch. Will you be able to stay until after the Q&A session, or should we deal with your questions now?
I'll wait for the questions, then I'll leave after the questions.
Thank you so much. We appreciate that.
Thank you. Thank
Right,
you.
so I'm going to, thank you. I'm going to then introduce Ms. Faith Nyaka. She is next on our program. She is the Chief Director for Quality Assurance and Accreditation Management at the National School of Government. She has been involved in the quality assurance of assessment for public and private schools, monitoring of private and public assessment bodies, colleges, schools, and community education and training sessions. And more recently, the evaluation and registration of qualifications and part qualifications on the NQF for the 3 quality councils. She's also responsible for the recognition and monitoring of professional bodies and the registration of professional designations for the purposes of the NQF. And the one thing that I am most excited about is that we've got a team at the NSG and we are working on finalizing a full qualification that the NSG would soon be able to offer. So thank you for that, Faith. And then when you are ready, you can start.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, colleagues. I'm going to take you through the National Framework towards the professionalization of the public sector. My task for this session was to unpack the implications of the framework for the ETD intervention in the public sector. The presentation will focus on the introduction, the context, the contextualization of the framework, the problem statement and the gaps that were identified, and also what would be the implication for the ETD. In the introduction, I've taken a prescript from the debate on the State of the National Address, which took place on the 9th of February 2023. These are the words from our then acting Minister for the Public Service and Administration, Mr. Thulas Nxesi. He took this out of the framework, but he summarized it very, very well. We introduced the framework to ensure that only ethical, qualified, and competent individuals are appointed into positions of authority. Secondly, a meritocratic public service must be staffed with capable, ethical, qualified, and professional public servants. And the overall objective of the framework is to ensure that we improve the capacity of government to deliver on public goods and services efficiently. In terms of priority 1 of the 6th administration, I think Prof stressed this. We want to build a capable, ethical, and developmental state. The framework, I think Soria has shared that on our platform. I'm not going to read each and every part of it because Prof has already spoken about this. What is more critical is that this framework, in terms of contextualization, is based on the 3 key terms there. We looked at the profession, we looked at professionalism, and we look at professionalization. For the profession, the discipline itself, we checked how knowledge, skills, and competencies are going to assist public servants to behave in a well, exemplary, and commit themselves to the profession and also its code of conduct. The implication here would be how will the ETD intervention contribute to this to ensure that these public servants are going to behave in a manner which is prescribed in terms of the discipline. And in terms of professionalism, what is professionalism? Contextually, we are looking at an individual a public servant who will demonstrate a high work ethic and adhere to standards and principles of specific work discipline that will include our qualifications, our skills, competencies, and values. As we are seen as government to ensure that we need to ensure that we upskill these public servants, the question that we'll also ask ourselves is to say, what kind of ETD intervention will contribute towards this one? And it entails to us that if it talks about qualifications, I think Suarez mentioned that we need to move towards ensuring that within this professionalization of the public sector, there are relevant qualifications that are going to equip these public servants with the skills and competencies. And the role of professionalization, it looks at the sector, the government itself. The government sees this as recognizing the various professional categories within the sector and subject them to registration with external regulated professional bodies. And in terms of us, our role here, in terms of ETD practitioners, including us as the NSG and everyone who's attending here, what role are we going to play in order to promote professionalization? Because we won't expect only professional bodies to be the ones that are going to regulate, give them registration without us also playing a role to ensure that we equip these public servants with the necessary skills and competences. There are, of course, problems that led to the development of the framework. There are a number of documents and research that have been consulted in designing the framework, and Prof indicated that it started for many years, but in this one, we took a diagnostic overview report from 2011 and also the 25-year review report that was published in 2019. In both reports, we find the same issues with regards to what are the problems that are faced by the public sector in terms of ensuring that we deliver public good and services. There is a problem of skills within the public sector. So our role, we need to ensure that we improve the skills of public servants because there's an erosion of the state role in producing professional, skilled professional. There were past practices to engage professional institute in the training and selection and development of senior managers. And this has seemed to be unsuccessful. And there's a looming crisis in the reproduction of professional expertise as we see the aging cohort leaving the system with expertise and knowledge. And there's a shortage of technical and managerial skills. And in the public sector, we depend mostly on outsourcing professional and technical services, while there are people who are actually appointed to perform that job. It's like it's a double dipping. We pay a salary and we also pay a consultant to do the same thing. And also at executive management level, in terms of reporting and recruitment structures, we have allowed a lot of political interference, which has resulted in unnecessary turbulence in senior management positions. At junior levels, we have not been seen doing sufficiently to provide stimulating career path to ensure that we reproduce those skills. We can no longer say after 27 years, it's after 28 years, we have been decisive, we lack decisiveness in interventions for professionalization of the public sector. That has been seen through consequences of fruitless expenditure, service delivery protests, and also fatalities and violence across the country. In terms of the research that was conducted by the PSTF and the University of Technology, they identified some skills gaps in the public sector that we need to deal with. The issue of that we are currently faced with we are operating in a digital world. Fourth industrial revolution, artificial intelligence, robotics, and Internet of Things. The question that we need to ask ourselves as the public sector and trainers, what kind of skills do we have to equip the public servants if the world is changing digitally to ensure that the current workforce that we have will still be able to perform their duties without us replacing them? What kind of programs do we need to put in place to upskill those public servants? The other risk that they identified in the research is the risk of automation in the public sector, because we cannot stay away from automation. We have to face the risk of automation. And they have identified the advantages and the disadvantages that are going to affect our business. The advantages for this, because we cannot stay without moving to automation. People are complaining about service delivery. So when we automate, the research indicated that it's going to improve our business models to provide improved and efficient services in the delivery of goods and services. And in terms of affecting our jobs, it will affect our jobs, but likely in areas where we require human performance. Instead, it will transform jobs and create a new or different tasks. For instance, for administrative tasks, those who are busy doing data consolidation will have to move to data analysis. The greatest disadvantage is that employees' tasks within those processes may not be needed anymore. The rate of displacement of employees will also increase. The question for what are the implications for ETD in terms of professionalization is to ensure that we move with times, that the employees who are currently employed in the public sector, before they become displaced, before they are no longer required in their work areas, what kind of new skills are we going to ensure that we equip them with so that we can keep them within the public sector, that we are not experiencing fruitless expenditure. They also identified jobs which are at high risk of automation by 2030. I'm not going to read each type of job there. You will see education is not highly affected. I think it's the lowest that is affected. However, as we provide that education and training, while we are still going to need those human bodies to be able to deliver the service, but those people need to be capable and competent to be able to utilize all those digital platforms to be able to deliver the education and training. The research also identified a future, a public servant. What kind of a public servant are we going to require in future? We need a public servant who's going to be resilient, who'll be a strategic thinker, a public servant who will be able to commission and contract with contracting and commissioning skills, coordination skills, networking skills, global competence, cognitive, social, and emotional, flexible, and who's also techno-savvy. A public servant who will have a digital skills. This is some of the research that has been undertaken in the public sector, which means when we want to professionalize and want to design program, we need to also focus on this. These are some of the implications to say going forward in terms of professionalization, what kind of a public servant, a model public servant are we going to produce? The research also highlighted the public service of the future. In the public service of the future, they say education normally ignored to develop cognitive and leadership skills. And currently, these are the key skills that are required internationally. And the most critical one is that training normally focuses on hard skills. But now we're saying training, according to the future public service, should focus on technical skills and also soft skills. And also we need evolving skill sets and ensure we need also to retain skilled and high performing individuals. And the research stresses upskilling that will require specialized and customized training. This has serious implication in terms of the ETD that we are going to roll out within the system, because the program that we are going to roll out needs also to ensure that it deals with the areas that were identified within this research. In terms of the framework, what are the implications for the ETD interventions in the public sector? I think Prof tried to list this. I'm not going to waste time. We've got the 5 pillars in terms of professionalization that were identified in the framework. The first pillar focused on recruitment and selection. If you look at the 5 pillars, we want to ensure that we professionalize a public servant prior to entry into the system and throughout his or her tenure into the system and until the person exits the system. This is how it has been designed. The first one is the pre-entry recruitment and selection. The second one will focus on induction and onboarding. The third one, planning and performance management. The fourth pillar is continuing learning and professional development. The last pillar will focus on career progression, succession planning, and management of career incidents, also of heads of department. You will realize that the framework did not only look at the lower levels of the employees in the public service, public sector, but also looked at the higher levels of the public servants who are the heads of administration. In terms of pillar one, I only extracted things that I felt that they will be relevant for this meeting. Prof stressed the issue of meritocratic appointments. And I know that in this group, we have people from government training institutes and heads of HR, management and development. The framework proposes that we need to appoint people based on meritocracy into the public sector, people who are competent, who meet the requirements of the position. And we need also to revise Nyukela, and I think it's going to have serious implication, and also extend it across the system. There has been debates even in cabinet when we are submitting this for approval that we need to make sure that Nyukela deals with the different occupations within the public sector. It should not be one size fits all, because we end up appointing people into senior positions who don't have those necessary skills that are required for that particular position. Because if you missed it during Nyukela, you missed it during your interview session, then the person already moves and enters the public system. So this has serious implications in terms of the ETD space, in terms of the plan to say, how are we going to ensure that this Nyukela is extended across the system? And across the system, we mean to, currently it's with senior management only. Recommendation are that it should also be extended to your deputy directors. It must also be extended to other sectors, local government. It must be extended to your SOEs and also to your police, the military, and the state security institutions. So there is a lot of implication that is going to have into the ETD, because we need to have ETD practitioners who will be able, I know that it's an online program, but the design of the program needs to make sure that it meets the needs of those sectors that we have already mentioned. Also, it calls for the integrity assessment and competency-based assessment. The competency-based assessment, also the outcry there was that it's also one size fits all. It needs to be differentiated for the specific jobs. Also, we need to review the academic entry requirements into SMS. This has serious implications for that partnership and collaboration that Prof has spoken about. And also for us as training institute to say, if they're going to review academic entry requirements into SMS level, those that are already within the system and those that are going to join the system, they need to enter the public service with a minimum of NQF level 8, and NQF level 9 will be a recommendation. So what are systems that we are going to put in place as ETD to ensure that there are relevant programs to ensure that there is upskilling of public servants who do not have this qualification? And the deadline there, we said by 2025, that would be reviewed. And that collaboration with higher education, professional bodies, industry, and departments to undertake curricular development. This is very critical. Prof mentioned that we receive learners in the public sector who are employees within the public sector who do not have the necessary skills and competencies, but these learners have undergone 3 years or 4 years of training. Then we put another 2 years for them before they start working. We give them internship. So if we can collaborate with higher education, professional bodies will ensure that we design programs, and as departments, as government, we can influence the kind of curriculum that is going to be designed by this higher education institution. In Pillar 2, it looks at induction and onboarding. What is very critical And in this place is that who should participate? I think the most critical issue is that everyone who's here knows what is induction in the public sector and what is onboarding, because we already have programs as the National School of Government to provide the induction and onboarding for public servants. However, the most critical issue here is that there are going to be timelines in terms of that at the time at which onboarding and induction is going to take place. The framework recommends immediately. If we fail to implement it immediately, we are given 90 days. Within 90 days of appointment, public servants need to go through the induction program, because later we keep a person for a year, a person commits the mistakes in the public service and they are fired, and people have not yet been taken through the induction process to understand what is the public service, especially those that are coming from outside. Also, the reorientation program for those that are serving, they need to go back into the simulator also to be reorientated, because there is changes within the system and also changes in legislation. It also looks at coaching and mentoring programs, and also that we need to collaborate with professional bodies to make them part of our onboarding of new employees. And who should participate? It's extended to local government, state-owned entities, institutions of traditional leadership, the military, police, state security, correctional services, staff appointed into political office, and their advisors. So implication is that we need capacity to ensure that we are going to be able to deliver these programs and ensure that the programs are designed in such a way that they're going to meet the needs or are going to be sectoral specific. In terms of Pillar 3, Pillar 3 is about your performance planning and management. The critical thing here is that the DPSA has to review all performance, must review the performance management system at all levels, from level 1 to level 16. Also, they need to align the performance management with professional body registration, which means there is a call for public servants to be registered with professional bodies so that professional bodies can play a role in terms of issues of code of conduct. So that if you are found wanting at work or by the professional body, and if your appointment also was based on registration with the professional body, you might lose your job. And also to link the performance of HODs and DDGs to the institution. And vice versa, also with us, you can't be highly performing if the institution is not performing. We've identified key professions that we need to prioritize for professionalization. We have listed them there, and I think most of us are affected, those who work in the HRM&D space. Those professions are key in the country and we need to start professionalizing. So what programs do we have to ensure that we professionalize? Do we have adequate programs that are relevant for these sectors or occupations that have been identified? Those are the implications for the ETD space. And also to collaborate with those professional councils in professionalizing. As Prof has indicated, the framework is not doing away with what is existing, but it supplements or complements what has already been existing to professionalize the public sector. The last pillar is Pillar 5. It looks at the career incidents, career progression and career incidents. The most relevant thing for us here is the issue of RPL. I think it's not new, but it's new in terms of how we implement it. It's giving problems within the sector, even in higher education, in the education sector. Implementation of RPL is problematic. Then now we want to put it into the public sector to explore its possibility for recruitment in the public sector. So what are the implications? Do we have public servants who will be able to implement this effectively and efficiently? That is also the implication for the ETD, because then we have to ensure that we provide programs and training for those that are going to be responsible to implement this function. And the Minister of Public Service and Administration has to determine the need for an assessment center for RPL. Where is it going to be situated? Who's going to work there? Do we have those competencies within the public sector? Who are the officials who are going to be appointed in departments to perform this function? Then it has implication for the group that is here. The issue of revolving door policy, Prof has mentioned it a bit. It provides for the movement of identified public servants between private sector, academia, and the public sector so that we can exchange the skills. In the public sector, we are good in practice. We know how to implement. In academia, they've got theory. So those two needs to find a way to ensure that when learners come out to do the work, they know theory plus implementation and practice. My last slide, in terms of the conclusion. As part of realizing a capable state, we are on the drive to rebuild the public service. We want to promote lifelong learning. We want to improve skills. We want to provide the necessary orientation to the public service. And this is happening across the government departments, as we have indicated. And there are special reforms that are strongly emphasized by this framework: the merit-based recruitment and appointment, the introduction of integrity testing before people join the public sector, revising the tenure of the heads of department to 10 years, and also the issue of curriculum development for ongoing learning of public servants. We expect this framework to be fully implemented across the departments and from the state entities from this year. Thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Ms. Nyaka. We've come to the end of this part of the program. We only have about 10 minutes for question and answers. And I would like to appreciate everyone that has posted the questions on the Q&A platform. In the interest of time, I have identified the themes that arose from the questions. So I'm going to ask our presenters to touch on just sort of the broad themes that came out in the questions. I'm going to read them and then I'm going to ask the presenters first, Prof. Masiremuli, and then Ms. Nyaka to respond to them. So Prof. Masiremuli, with regard to your presentation, the one theme that came through is the impact of fear and corruption within the context of the implementation of the professionalization framework, and how do we deal with that to actually bring the impact of the professionalization framework as it is intended. Then there's a question around the return on investment for running the public sector as a business and what the implications of that is. And also a question around, is there any planning to infuse the contents of the framework in the curriculum of future public servants that are coming through the system? Then Ms. Nyaka, and perhaps Prof, if you can assist with it, there's a question around practical succession planning, if you can just talk to that. Professor, the expanding or the application of the framework to political appointees, what is the intention thereof? There's a question around, do we need ETD specialists for the implementation of this framework? And then a question around the role of professional bodies and how are we going to deal with the payment of fees, and are there any plans to support public servants around this? So I'm going to ask you, Professor, to start first, and then we'll move on to Ms. Nyaka. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Soria, and excellent questions. I also managed to go through those questions, but thank you so much for categorizing them thematically. Perhaps just to start with the first theme, which relates to the framework, the prospect for the implementation of the framework in the context of the existing challenges that we are confronted with. And I want to also answer that question in the context of the specific question, which I think it was posed by Kakaza Nomfundo, where she made reference to a very unfortunate phenomena of fear, in the context of performance management. In other words, how do we implement professionalization in the context of fear, particularly as it relates to performance management? My quick answer to that, which will also relates to many other aspects that relates to all these unnecessary things, such as your corruption, fraud, so forth and so on. My direct question, Nomfundo, is that fear is as a result of intimidation. And in South Africa, intimidation is a crime. We do have the law, Intimidation Act. Anybody found guilty of intimidating another person could be liable to a fine of 20,000 or 10 years in jail. All what I'm trying to say is that we need to confront particularly some of these issues that you guys are raising, which are critically important because they are an impediment to what we seek to achieve through a professionalization. But we cannot put up with that. Unfortunately, there are various legal instruments that we could actually use to challenge these unfortunate constraints which continues to exist in our respective environment. But more importantly, I think the biggest weapon that we have is our sense of commitment to do what is right for the country. And obviously, as you do so, inevitably there are so many dangers along the way. But we cannot just fold our arms because of those dangers, because if we do so, the entire country is going to collapse, So we need to make sure that we use all available legal instruments for us to really challenge many of these impediments that seek to really impact negatively on what we seek to achieve. Return on investment. I want us to maybe coin that logic so that it could really resonate with what we seek to achieve in the context of the public sector. Return on investment should be understood as the extent to which we make people happy with our contribution towards enhancing their welfare. That ought to be understood as a return on investment. The extent to which people are happy with the quality of the services that we are actually delivering to them, right? And a professional public service is actually characterized that. In other words, we need to draw a sense of satisfaction from the extent to which people are happy. And I have a sense that we do have the capacity to do that. There was another question linked to, which I want to use it as an example to latch on this point about the fact that we have the capacity challenge in the public sector. Sometimes I tend to think that the issue might not necessarily be capacity. The issue is capability. How do we get things done? And to get things done is often the function of our sense of public service, or our sense of public service. Colleagues, if you remember, at some point in our history as the post-apartheid South Africa, there was a particular moment where the level of service delivery in this country was at its highest. That was when we were preparing for the World Cup. A criminal will commit an offense in less than an hour, you'll have been arrested, prosecuted, and if found guilty, punished, right? And there was just this thing. What happened to that? Because I still believe that thing, it is still there. Perhaps what we need is just to make sure that we begin to invest more in reorientating our public service so that they could begin to have this strong sense of public service. Only yesterday or a day before yesterday, during shutdown, the police were at their level. We saw capacity of the state in action, right? And it was for me, it was not just even in terms of the number that we saw on our screen of our security system, right? It was also how they dealt with the shutdown itself, right? The quality of the service that they rendered in terms of managing the whole thing. You know, so I think we do have the capacity. The question is, how do we translate that capacity into a capability with ethical disposition? That is something that we need to begin to really make sure that we go deep into ourselves and invoke that sense of public service, which I believe that it is there. It's just a question of getting into it. The last one, how expanding the framework to politicians. Look, you are correct. There is no way that we can succeed in terms of implementing the framework without involving politicians in one way or another. In one of the recommendations that we made, particularly which emerged from very interesting discussion in the ministerial task team, was specifically around how do we deal with the challenge of political administrative interface. A key recommendation emerged from those discussions that perhaps politicians, that is ministers or political principals and senior officials should go through the same course on political administrative interface. And we did also make a recommendation that the NHG perhaps should repackage that program so that they can design a particular pedagogical approach that will accommodate both sides of the same coin, the political dimension and the administrative dimension. Lastly, also as it relates to politicians, NSG is making significant strides in terms of ensuring that politicians also go through certain executive management, what you call a program. There is a program which targets specifically political principle, and I've seen quite a number of politicians who have already gone through that program. So indeed, what you are saying is critically important. We should as well pay a closer attention to politicians if we are to succeed in implementing the framework. Thank you, Soria, and sorry maybe for taking your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Prof, for that. I'm going to hand over to Ms. Nyaka. If there are any of the issues outstanding that you would like to touch on. We are running slightly behind schedule, and we will try and answer some of your questions in writing. But maybe let's allow around 5 minutes for you to just reflect on some of the issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Others, will respond to the chat for the ones that you have raised. The first one is with regard to the issue of practical succession planning. If you can look at the presentation, the issue of succession planning has been identified as a problem statement, which means as a public sector, we have identified that we are not doing it right. And there are leading departments in terms of the recommendations in the framework to say and proposal on how to implement it. The DPSA has been tasked with a role to lead that, to ensure that we do have proper succession planning policies and plans, and we implement them in the public sector. And in terms of that plan, it will come from the DPSA to guide the public sector. And also the implication would be that we need to be ready to have programs to support those incumbents so that they will be ready to take up those positions that they are looking towards for. And also for the individual, that individuals also need to take the responsibility. If you can see that 3 diagram, it talks about the individual. Faith herself, what is it that I'm going to do to make sure that professionally I am developed besides waiting for the government, so that I am ready to take up positions if they come forward in the public sector. We do have those required skills. And the issue of payment, I think, of professional registration, this has been a thorn in the flesh, because the example that normally they give to say, if we pay for professional registrations, do we know that nurses are paying from their salaries? Teachers, even a PL1 teacher who earns below a director and a deputy director in the public service and an assistant director, they are paying their registration fees directly to professional council. So because the public sector for professionalization includes everyone, I don't think it's going to be fair for other professionals to pay others being subsidized, or the government is paying for them. So the issue would be that individuals will have to pay for those registration fees. And I think the government needs to ensure that the fees that are charged are reasonable. There will be engagements and negotiations with professional bodies when we embark on this, based on the plans, and the leading departments will be doing this. And the other issue would be ETD specialist. You need to be an ETD specialist to implement the framework. I think the framework is broader than ETD specialist. It involves other areas within the development and of a public servant. So ETD specialists will be part, and other who are not even ETD specialists will be affected to implement the framework. And the last part, I think you spoke about how are we going to ensure that we appoint credible employees, timeless vetting, and that we don't do nepotism. I didn't speak about the role of the Public Service Commission. The Public Service Commission is going to develop a pool of experts that are going to be part of the interview panels for senior management position, to ensure that we appoint relevant people, and also people, when they are not happy about the appointments, I think the Public Service Commission has the responsibility to make sure that those things are done properly, appointments in the public service. The issue of vetting, to do it timelessly and so forth, we know that it is slow. However, there are leading departments in terms of doing that. We are including the SIU and others. So this will be some of the things that we need to discuss with them, because if the framework says you must be vetted before you join the public service. I'll give you an example with me. I joined NSG in 2020. In 2020, I received a call yesterday that they want to finalize my vetting. So that would be something that needs to be taken up with them, to say, how are we going to ensure that, because it's going to affect the appointment and the recruitment process. It also needs to be addressed. Thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you so much for briefly touching on the issues.
Hi, Soria.
Yes.
Just maybe just a last point, and I'm sorry that I missed it, which relates to the universities and professionalization. And yes, we are going to engage, particularly the heads of the departments of public administration or public management, or whatever that they call it in the country, around the professionalization of the public sector, because inevitably their curriculum ought to change. There is still a lot that needs to be done. We need to reinterrogate the philosophical and theoretical basis of the discipline in the country as it has always been taught. Because what is emerging now is a new orientation of the future public servant. And universities, like as I indicated, if you remember my presentation, deliberately emphasized the significance of partnership. And I said that universities, like any other ETD sector, is a very important partner, particularly in relation to the implementation of the professionalization of, in relation to the implementation of the professionalization framework. And therefore, there is no way that we can actually think about succeeding in terms of implementing the framework if the universities in particular are not on board, because universities are what we call a source of talent pipeline. And for us to get what we want, we must make sure that the source is corrected, and it becomes our responsibility as part of working towards the implementation of the framework that we need to have a conversation with the university. But thank you so much for that question, because it is critically important. Yes, in a nutshell, the curriculum ought to change. Thank you so much, Soria.
Thank you, Professor Maserimole, for coming back to that. I think it's a very important point that was also raised. I want to conclude by thanking the speakers of this session, Prof. Maserimole, for taking the time out to join us. Ms. Nyaka, thank you so much for standing in for Dr. Naja. We appreciate this very brief introduction. I do understand that you may have some time challenges, so again, thank you, and you are welcome to excuse yourself from the session if you need to do that. So next on the program, we have Dr. Jos Wassen going to touch on measuring the outcomes and impact of ETT interventions in the public service. Welcome to the session, Dr. Jos. Dr. Jos is an evaluation advisor at the Independent Evaluation Group. He was there since 2016 and is the deputy head of the Global Evaluation Initiative since 2021. He's been working in evaluation research since 1998, first as an academic evaluation consultant and later on as a lead evaluator. He has conducted and led evaluations for multilateral and bilateral developmental organizations in a range of policy fields such as agriculture, environment, science, education, health, and others. He's also authored several internationally peer-reviewed publications, which includes 3 books. I want to just mention some of the names: Mind the Gap, Perspectives on Policy Evaluation and the Social Sciences. And his most recent one is Dealing with Complexity in Development Evaluation, a Practical Approach. So Dr. Wassen, thank you so much. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Soria, for this kind introduction, and thank you for the kind invitation to this webinar, which is highly interesting. Let me share my screen. Can you see my screen?
We can, if you can just put it in presentation mode. Yes, yeah. Perfect. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. I'm going to perhaps switch off my camera so you can focus on the presentation rather than my face, which is more interesting. Esteemed colleagues, it's a pleasure to be here and to share some thoughts with you on the topic of how do we evaluate training programs. First, before I start, a caveat. I'm not an educational researcher. I am a professional evaluator who has been involved in the evaluation, among other things, of adult learning programs. And in doing so, I have always focused, together with my colleagues, on 2 principal dimensions. So first is the evaluation of the training program itself, the causal pathways of change, and how the program is contributing to desired objectives, among other things. And secondly, also to understand the role of training and the broader complex processes of building capacity, especially in government. And I have been undertaking this work more recently in the context of the Global Evaluation Initiative, which is a global program that aims to support monitoring and evaluation capacity development in countries. So understanding how capacities are built and the role of training in confluence with other interventions and taking into account complex contextual conditions is a very important evaluative question for us. So I'm going to talk about 3 things. I will start with a brief introduction on how we could conceptualize the evaluation of training programs, and I will do that specifically for illustrative purposes in the context of the Global Evaluation Initiative, this program that aims to build M&E capacities in government. Secondly, I will briefly elucidate an example, the example of the International Program on Development Evaluation Training, which is a global training program in monitoring and evaluation organized annually. And finally, I will conclude with some broader reflections on the evaluation of training, the effectiveness of training programs in the framework of what we are aiming for, which eventually is organizational change and the capabilities of organizations to contribute to better service delivery, to better lives. Okay, so let me start with a bit of context. This is the theory of change of the Global Evaluation Initiative. Please do not read it because it is guaranteed to put you to sleep very soon. So let me try to recapitulate the main points. So the Global Evaluation Initiative aims to strengthen the use of evaluative evidence, monitoring evidence in public policies. So it aims to influence the use of evidence in design, planning, adaptive management of policies and programs. And it aims to achieve that by strengthening the supply and demand for evaluative and monitoring evidence in public policy. And it aims to achieve that in turn by improving outcomes around individual capacities, so the capacities of different stakeholders to produce and use monitoring and evaluative evidence, which also contributes to organizational practices and an organizational change. And a third dimension is changes in the enabling environment, the legislative and policy context for monitoring and evaluation. And these three levels of capacities are supported through different types of interventions. And one area of intervention is training and professional development. Two other areas of intervention are country level direct engagement with institutions and providing technical assistance and advisory support. And the final area is also to generate and share knowledge about good practices in monitoring and evaluation capacity development through events and through learning products. So this is just to situate the role of training and professional development activities, which we support at global, regional, and institution-specific levels in the broader context of the interventions that we support to try to bring about change. So again, this summarizes our view on capacity development, which has an individual, an organizational, and a broader enabling environment dimension. And we directly intervene, try to influence these three different levels, but of course, they are also causally interlinked with each other. So that is something to keep in mind when we evaluate the effectiveness of training programs. We do not just want to understand whether there is learning, knowledge uptake, and changes in practices, but we also want to understand what this means in the complex real context of public policy environments. Again, to contextualize, even in the already quite ambitious areas of strengthening individual capacities, training programs are but one of several interventions that are needed to bring about individual capacity change. We also work explicitly on facilitating internships, providing technical assistance on evaluations, providing written guidance, and so on. So again, even on the individual capacity development front, there are several interventions that are needed to strengthen individual capacities. And this should also be situated in the competencies that we try to develop, in this case, evaluator competencies. It already becomes quite clear from this list of different types of competencies, which relate to evaluation expertise, methods expertise, and increasingly this includes knowledge of data and knowledge of data science applications, management expertise, communication and interpersonal skills, integrity and ethics, institutional expertise, knowledge of the subject or sector, and knowledge of the country, knowledge of the region, knowledge of particular target groups, etc. So it immediately becomes clear then that in order to instill these competencies, to build these competencies among colleagues in the public sector, training is not enough. It requires a long-term engagement that it involves multiple types of interventions. There's a lot of on-the-job learning. There's a lot of long-term technical assistance and advisory support that is needed to sustain, let's say, broad-based learning among public servants in the public sector. So let us now go to training programs more specifically within this broader context of developing individual capacities, but also trying to bring about institutional change for better policies and better lives. So if we want to conceptualize an evaluation about an individual training program, it is helpful to start with the classical Kirkpatrick 4-level model. This model has been around for a number of decades. It has also been criticized, and rightly so, but I still think it constitutes a very good basis for conceptualizing causal change as it occurs through training, but then it should be broadened. The framework for evaluative work should be broadened to take into account additional dimensions that are important to take on board. So the 4-level model may be familiar to some or most of you. Level 1 is basically satisfaction about a training program. Level 2 is there learning taking place? So has knowledge increased in relation to what participants knew before? Level 3 is about, does that knowledge translate into changes in professional practice? And then finally, level 4, do these changes in professional practice, are they able to really bring about organizational change and sustained organizational capacity development in function of better implementing the mandate of the organization that we are talking about. So this is a very useful heuristic conceptual model to develop an evaluation framework around. And it quite easily translates into what I would call a generic theory of change of a training program. Now, this generic theory of change can be adjusted to most, if not all, types of training programs. It's just a very simple heuristic framework that would require a lot of adaptation, but it's a good starting point when one starts to think about causal change in training. And we know that there are different important aspects of a training program, starting from the identification of training needs, to the design of the training, to the implementation, to the participants learning from the training, participants changing their behavior, and finally the organization changing as a result of the training and other factors. Now, this framework offers to look at these different steps in more detail. So it gives you information about underlying indicators. For example, when we look at design of training, we know that we should look at the content and the quality of the curriculum. When we look at learning, we should try to assess knowledge uptake through various tools. But it also helps us to hypothesize more specifically. For example, the extent to which or whether training implementation leads to actual learning has to do with what is actually being taught, and does it offer added value? Is it being taught well and with the right pedagogical tools, for example? Whether participants' learning translates into changes in behavior has to do with many factors. It has to do with not just the knowledge that participants acquired, but also whether participants have incentives or they have the resources to apply what they learned. And whether that changes, again, organizational practices and organizational capacities more sustainably, again, is related to many other complex factors that relate to staff turnover, political stability, strategic priorities, and so on. So again, this is a simple illustration of a causal framework that provides the foundation for thinking about how training may influence learning and may influence professional practice and institutional change. So this provides the basis for a lot of our thinking on evaluation. So let's talk briefly about a specific case. The International Program for Development Evaluation Training is a global training program that brings together participants from across the globe to learn about evaluation and monitoring issues. So the core of the program is on-site and online learning, which of course different in nature, but is also supported by specific interventions around scholarships, to improve access for particular groups of participants, especially from lower income strata of society. It also has an important community and peer-to-peer learning component. And apart from the global training, there are also customized trainings. In the end, the idea is to reach multiple audiences with a diversified, customized offer on different aspects of the field of monitoring and evaluation. So how does IPDAT evaluate itself, or how is IPDAT evaluated? This is a part of the evaluation framework, the most important aspects of it. So first of all, it is important that there's some kind of summative evaluation. So are the trainings really leading to learning and the application of that learning in a professional practice, for example, and does that lead to organizational change? But it's also very important to have formative evaluations in place. So basically using evaluation for continuous learning and improvement, and to support these both of these types of evaluative uses, IPDAT has put in place a system of ongoing quality assessment and learning, which is based on rigorous, standardized workshop evaluations, and also standardized and also more ad hoc reflections among instructors. So that these tools offer both opportunities for continuous feedback around, what can we improve in terms of content, pedagogy, or other learning conditions in order to optimize learning. But there's also an important accountability component to it. For example, the workshop evaluations are published online. Everybody can look at them, and you can also see how the program is being adapted on the basis of each year's learnings on the delivery of the main program. So that's an important aspect. And secondly, a few years ago, IPDAT implemented a tracer study, which looked at various aspects and phases of learning. And let me say a few words about that. So the tracer study was very useful and important, and I would say it is one of the tools that potentially can generate useful information about whether and the extent to which a training program is achieving its objectives. It's imperfect, we can talk about it in more detail, but it's useful. The IPDAT tracer study looked at various aspects. It looked at aspects of reach and access. Are we reaching the right people? Are learners satisfied with the learning offer and the conditions around it? Are participants learning? Do they apply their knowledge in a professional practice? And there were also other effects that were looked at, for example, the accreditation and reputational value of the training. So a certain accreditation or reputational value can strengthen, for example, your job prospects in the job market. There were also important community building and peer-to-peer exchange effects. And finally, there were also indications that trainings about M&E and of course the application of that knowledge in a professional practice contributed to strengthening the institutionalization of evaluation in the organizational context of the participants. The methodology of this evaluation was fairly straightforward. It included semi-structured interviews with alumni, instructors, and employers, and also a survey covering the same groups, which allowed for descriptive statistical analysis and important qualitative content analysis. And this study generated quite useful findings around the learning outcomes of the trainings, the satisfaction about the trainings, how and to what extent and in what ways knowledge was translated into professional practice. One interesting aspect was that there are clear differences in the potential for change and potential for learning around on-site and online trainings. And as we know, online trainings have really come up in recent years. On-site trainings had as an important benefit that there are strong peer-to-peer learning effects, so among participants, and also strengthened networks afterwards. Whereas online trainings offer much broader reach. So people who cannot travel, who cannot stay away from their job for a prolonged period of time are still able to participate. And also the online assessment really shed light on how innovative techniques like e-learning platforms, e-learning techniques like Mural, and particular online pedagogical techniques, how they can help to improve the quality and delivery of the training. And instructors were trained in the pedagogy of online training, which also was very interesting. But still, there are limitations to what such a study can do. So just to give you a little bit of context, but not to promote that this should be done everywhere or at all times, there are different options available for evaluating training programs rigorously. So the foundation is formative assessment in the professional practice, and also summative assessment using, workshop specific or training specific standardized questionnaires and all sorts of qualitative tools. That's the basis. The next step would be to conduct tracer surveys to understand better the translation of knowledge into professional practice and potential further effects. But if you would like to evaluate training programs more rigorously, there are more other techniques that can help you do that in exceptional circumstances. And we are considering conducting survey experiments. And there's, of course, also an option to do an RCT, but we think that's not cost effective at the moment to do this. Now, back to the bigger picture. Okay, it's very important to understand how training programs work, contribute to learning outcomes, and contribute to changes in the professional practice. But now let us go back to this broader picture. How does training help, and under what conditions does it help to bring about organizational change, sustained improvement of organizational capacities, and benefits for policies and lives? So from the Global Evaluation Initiative perspective, and this goes also for many other training initiatives, there's diversity in audiences, there's diversity in contexts. So we have to look very carefully also at the training mix. What competencies are being instilled with what training modalities and what pedagogical approaches for which audiences? So carefully looking at that mix is very important. And it is very important to be culturally responsive in both the method as well as the content of the training. And these are, of course, aspects that need to be looked at also in evaluative exercises, and they require an experience-based qualitative approach. And then secondly, it's also very important to understand training in the context of organizational change. It's very clear, and we all agree, that you need more than training to enhance your professional skills, but also you need to understand more than just individual capacity development to understand how organizational environments improve. So in order to understand the role of training in that broader picture, you need to understand the evolving learning needs of institutions, the evolving learning needs of different audiences, and how this links to customized mixed offer of trainings, you also require a broader reflection on how training programs can be complemented. So how alleviating the knowledge constraint in combination with complementary interventions like improving the enabling environment, changing incentive structures, improving labor conditions, clarifying roles and responsibilities, how all these organizational level interventions together with training can enhance the potential for change in organizational practice and capacity, and eventually more deeper line change. So these are all fundamental questions that you need to take into account in a broader assessment of effectiveness. So how do you then complement training level assessments? And again, this is not something that you would do, every day. This is something that you would do very periodically, and you would plan it very carefully. In our case, given the fact that we are an international program, we would use a case study approach to understand particularly how M&E systems change at the country level, but also at the organizational level. For example, I've been working recently with the Ministry of Finance and Economic Affairs in Malawi, or the Department of National Planning in Colombia, to understand how capacities change in these institutions and in the broader national M&E system. I need to reflect on, okay, what are some of the causal factors that influence this? The political factors, the existing institutional capacities, the incentives, etc. And in order to understand such a complex picture, you have to develop a case study approach or a comparative case study approach. And you basically argue from the right to the left. You want to understand what are the factors explaining capacities, and what are and how can you influence some of these factors with interventions such as technical assistance and training? And you want to see how that worked in the past. So that is a complementary evaluative approach. And then also knowledge. So simply the generation of knowledge. So we also learn through knowledge uptake in events, but also through reading knowledge products. And that can be assessed in various ways, but one way would be to do an online influence analysis using web scraping techniques, using topic modeling techniques to understand how particular knowledge products are helping to change discussions or debates in public sector environments on particular topics, for example. Okay, so that was a little bit of broader context on the evaluation of training programs. So let me conclude now. So to conclude, when we evaluate training programs, it is important to have a two-pronged perspective, to have a rigorous, systematic approach, which doesn't need to be very costly. It can be fairly cheap, to assess the different aspects of training, design, implementation, delivery, learning, practice change, and organizational change. So that's one part. But also secondly, to think about how we can better understand through evaluation, more informally, how training and other professional development activities under what conditions can be an effective solution for strengthening capacities and strengthening organizational practices in the public sector. And regarding the role of evaluation, it's very important to think about metrics and standardized tools, but I didn't talk much about that. More importantly, it's to consider evaluation as fit for purpose. If you want to bring about change in the public sector through training, think about a very good formative evaluation model with standardized tools like student evaluations, instructor reflections, etc. But build that into the practice of ongoing training. Think about what summative evaluations are needed to basically to defend the funding that was invested in the program, but also to show broader accountability of the investment in capacities, but also to make decisions then about improvement. And finally, take into account how training fits into the broader policy mix of trying to change capacities in the public sector. So let me stop here. Thank you very much for your attention. Over to you, Chair.
Thank you so much, Dr. Watson. We really appreciate that very broad overview and introduction to a field that I am not understanding at all. So I'm have a lot of appreciation for you giving us that overview and sharing your experiences with us. So next on the program, we have Alana Baker. Alana is joining us from Calgary, Alberta. She's a Canadian citizen. I'm not sure if you are currently there, because if you are, then it's very early in the morning for
No.
you.
I'm not there. I'm in Paris. That's
Okay,
where the
that
OECD,
helps a
but I
bit.
am from Calgary.
Okay, so welcome and thank you for joining us. We do appreciate you taking the time out to come and speak to us on the topic of the future of schools of government. Alana is a policy analyst with Public Employment and Management. She at some point was a journalist at the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, and she holds an MPP from the University of Cambridge, an MRes from the University College of London, and an MBA from the Porto Business School. Thank you so much, Alana. I'm going to hand over to you.
Hi, thanks for having me. Yeah, that's right. So I'm in Paris. That's where the OECD is based. But I am from Calgary. That's my home city in Alberta in Canada. I haven't lived there in a long time, but you've done your research, well done. So I'm going to just share my screen really quick. If I can find it here. Can everybody see that all right?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, great. So what I'm going to talk a bit about today, and what I've kind of been asked to talk about, is about schools of government in particular, and a lot of the trends and the future of things that are happening with them. My slides have a lot on them. They can be a bit busy, so I'm going to try to point out the important things on them, but I can also send these slides on after if that's of interest. So you can just go ahead and let me know about that. Just trying to clear off my screen. There's a strike in Paris, and so I'm doing this from home, and so I don't have the setup that I would like to have. There we go. So there we go. So I guess what is important to talk about right now is what we're asking of our civil servants when we are training them, and what schools of government are trying to instill. So an important thing to note is that, you know, modern governance is not really what it used to be. And the policy challenges call on new skills and competencies kind of while we're still establishing the old ones. So we've been hearing for a long time that, you know, the future is coming. We have to prepare for these things. But I think when we look around, we can agree that the future is here. And a lot of the challenges that we're facing are not going to go away. And that calls on new things, especially for leaders in government. It calls on many new skills. So especially in management styles, this used to mean that there are, you know, traditional management styles, very hierarchical, direction giving, and that's really moved more to this trust-based management, a lot of mentorship and development that's happening in the workplace. Technical skills used to be really important, and now we're seeing a focus on competencies and behaviors and values. Where things used to be valued in government, that was more predictability, stability, taking direction. And we have to think more innovatively. We have to embrace digital cultures and digital skills. And we have to be able to do this in a situation of kind of ongoing crises and a need for resilience. The issues that are facing governments are really different than face a lot of other sectors. And there's a lot of constraints and a lot of different stakeholders and a lot that's at stake as well. And so it requires a lot of change management skills, and also more than ever, an ability to think about global issues and the connectivity of the world. We saw it so much in COVID, that just putting policies in place that thought about our own local region or our own country even, were not always that effective. And it requires a lot of cooperation and also the ability to have foresight about what's happening in the world. So it's important to think about what these shifts mean for schools of government, for trainers, for learning and development, and how they can instill, these new skills. So it's not just a matter of teaching, financial management, although that's still important. It's a matter of teaching attitudes and behaviors and changing cultures. And that is a really difficult thing to do. And so it's a challenge for schools of government and trainers. So it might help to talk a little bit about what we do with the OECD on this. This is one of our frameworks. So when I'm talking about civil service systems, especially for senior management, a lot of what we focus on is trying to get the senior civil service instill skills to get them into this top right corner. So this is the capable senior civil servants, as well as an operating environment that is supportive and allows them to use the skills. The skills that civil servants have are only as good as the situation and the environment that they are working in. So that's something to keep in mind as well, that once leaders have been instilled with the skills that they need an environment where they are able and supported to use them. And a lot of evaluation comes into effect there as well. So the last speaker was talking a lot about that, and it's really interesting work that's very difficult to do. So that was very interesting. So at the OECD, we work a lot on, public sector leadership and skills and this learning and development, information. And so this might help to understand kind of where I'm coming from. So I work in the Directorate for Public Governance, and we are governed by OECD member countries and formal bodies and committees. The one that applies to me is the Public Governance Committee. And then within my work stream, we have a network of schools of government that is a formal network at the OECD as well as a working party on public employment and management. And underneath these, we have an official recommendation that has been signed by OECD countries, things that they will try to abide to do within their own public service. And within that recommendation, we're able to run a lot of surveys with OECD countries. And so I can present some of the data from our latest ones in that today. So a lot of the data that you'll see has to do with that. But this is the recommendation. So you can see that it has these 3 pillars and then all these 14 principles that are underneath. And every year we survey on a couple of these. And this year we surveyed on the learning culture. We also surveyed on mobility and adaptive working environments. But today I'll focus a lot on the data from the learning survey that we did. And so that principle that I just showed you is our principle 9 on leadership, capability, and focusing specifically on the learning culture. And then these are the principles underneath that countries are working on when they're developing their learning and development systems in their country. So one of the things that we're asking them to do is to identify employee development as a core task of management in the public service, and to share that responsibility in developing employees. It's also important to incentivize employees in the right way, and that usually means non-financial. So this means that it should be an expectation, and there should be a learning culture of continuous self-development. This should be taken into account for things like performance evaluations, promotion decisions, and it should be something that is expected of people who are working in government. But in order to do that, the government itself and the school has to be able to value different learning approaches. And that means offering different topics, different ways of learning, and thinking about the needs and the ambitions of each learner. And because often a one-size-fits-all approach doesn't work, especially in governments where there are so many different types of employees and so many different ministries. When we're talking about a learning culture, this is sort of what we mean. So I just alluded to this, but we're trying to help governments get to a point where learning is part of the culture and it's an expectation. So it's a part of the job. It's not something that just happens in onboarding. It's not something that only happens before people join the government. It's aligned with this incentive system for growth within roles in the government. Managers support the development of staff, and importantly, they also engage in learning. Learning is not something that stops when somebody gets to a leadership role. Especially given the emphasis on competencies and behaviors. It's something that maybe becomes even more important when people get into leadership roles, so that they can have those behaviors and attitudes that makes the difference in a trickle-down effect throughout the entire public service. So I can sort of get into some of the data that we have that might help compare what's happening across different countries. A lot of this specific data that I'm showing you when it is in the blue like this is from that survey that we did. Necessarily, it is a survey of only OECD countries and some countries that are up for accession into the OECD. But there's a bit of data in here as well that's from a different survey that Brazil's School of Government did with us, and that also reached out to some other countries, including South Africa. So some of that information might be a bit better for comparison, but hopefully this gives you an idea of where things are at. So this shows in OECD countries what the learning and development plan is and how it's organized at the very basic level of it. So most OECD countries have a centralized plan, although there's a lot of variation in the implementation. You can see the green boxes show that just over 50% have some sort of central strategy or plan. Even if there's a central plan and there's something in ministries, there is some sort of overarching strategy for the entire central government. But the way it's rolled out changes. So the second box that you see on this screen shows who's responsible for delivering the training. This was not a mutually exclusive question, which is why they don't all add up to 100%. But you can see that there is some mix. So about 50% of countries have a national school of government or similar that is responsible for training, but many of them also have training within each ministry that is maybe conducting more specialized training, or maybe they're very siloed and maybe it's not the best approach, but this is what is happening right now inside OECD governments. So I think maybe one of the most important things to talk about first is what people are trying to teach. What are people learning? And there is definitely a need to shift more towards competencies and behaviors, especially at top levels. And so we asked schools and governments what their top 5 skills were that they were trying to instill in the most important training right now, the priorities for what they need to teach. So for non-managers, we see probably not unexpectedly digital skills, teamwork, and a lot of these more behavioral competencies starting to come to the top of the priority list: communication, innovative thinking. And then we saw also things maybe we weren't totally surprised about for senior managers. So leadership skills are really at the forefront for a priority that governments are trying to instill into their managers. Digital ways of working are important as well as change management in this, kind of crisis-ridden environment that we're in. The change is inevitable and it's happening all the time. And so having senior managers that are able to manage that change is very important. We did see that some things were more at the bottom of this list that we thought might be a little higher up, but the way we asked the question, they could only pick 5 things. So they had to prioritize something. But some things that we saw near the bottom, policy evaluation, global competencies, that way of global thinking is pretty near the bottom for both of them. Data analytics and an understanding, the SDGs are closer to the bottom as well. Perhaps it's not as surprising given the country respondents. And then if we ask different countries, they would maybe say different things, which is what happens with this other survey. So this is the one that Brazil's School of Government did in conjunction with us, and they asked a bigger variety of countries around the world, sort of the same questions. And so they asked basically what programs are being offered and developed. So that's on one side of the slide. And then they also asked about the priority programs in the next 5 years. So that's basically what skills are really coming up that they know they need to focus on. And we see there, again, the same sort of things: innovation, new types of leadership, digital skills. And we do see some of these other things move higher up. So the SDGs are higher up, as are global competencies in this other group that was surveyed. This helps us know about just the funding models and the total operating environment. So this was the survey of schools of government again. This one was ours. So not the one from Brazil. And so this shows basically that most of the funding in schools of government is coming from government allocations. Most dedicated schools of government are not getting the majority of their funding from fees for the courses. So this is schools that are providing training for free, funded by government allocations. And that reflects the way that most schools exist, which is what this slide shows. So most schools exist sort of within a government. About 84–85% of schools are basically a wing or a public body within the government. It's funded that way and it's organized that way. So that explains a lot of the funding models. Of course, a lot of countries also have schools of government or universities that focus mainly on training civil servants that make up a big part of the training as well. But for once public servants actually get into government, the school of government is generally part of the central government. So this slide has a lot on it, but don't panic, because I've highlighted the important part. I've just kind of included it all so you can see kind of how we're making these conclusions. This is talking about trying to find the right mix of incentives to instill this learning culture. And that does not mean financial incentives, which is really important. Very few schools offer financial incentives for learning, But those that do find that it's doesn't really instill a learning culture, and in fact, it may have the opposite effect, is that employees think that in order to continue learning, they deserve an extra payment, and then it's not part of the job. So what we're seeing more and more is these emerging trends of incentives that are in this yellow box here. And this is what we would like to see countries do to instill this learning culture. So considering learning and development in performance evaluations, setting that expectation that it's something that employees should do as part of their job, developing individual learning plans with employees so that they know what they need to work on. Managers know what employees would like to work on, where they'd like to go in their careers. And then importantly, considering this in promotion decisions. So especially into the top levels, people should be promoted because they've developed these competencies in themselves, rather than tenure or seniority, for instance. People should be promoted because they have the appropriate competencies for the job. And that's really important for leadership and managers. This is another bit of research that we did in a totally separate project that was a case study on resilience. And I wanted to mention it here because resilience is so important for all governments at this point, with the number of crises and all the things that are changing all the time. But it was important for this because the key findings were essentially that in order to instill resilience in a government and in a public service, learning is at the center of all of it. So these green boxes that I've highlighted show all of the lessons learned that are directly linked to learning. So crisis leadership and management capacities need to be strengthened through learning and development. Leadership needs to have change agents, and there needs to be this culture of continuous improvement. Surge capacity through the development of skills has to be in place before a crisis. So it's important that a workforce has all these skills and capabilities before they're needed, and that career-long learning needs to be the new norm in a job in order to have a resilient public service. And in order to do this, we're looking at how employee development is emerging as an expected task of the job for managers and leaders. So it's shifting some of the responsibility just from the employee themselves, but also onto managers who should be expected to develop their teams, develop their units, and make sure that there's a pipeline of talent and that skills don't stagnate. They can identify skill gaps and make sure that they're addressed in order to keep that resilience and that capability in the public service going. So some things about this were really encouraging. You can see the green box is that a lot of governments now have managerial competency frameworks in place, and the majority of these are including employee development, especially in OECD countries, because that is part of the recommendation that we have, that they have signed on to do. Other things are emerging. So these yellow boxes, they're starting to list these managerial competencies to develop employees as part of the job description. So when people are applying, they know this is expected of them. And they're taking this into account in a manager's performance evaluation. So that will affect, their career and their growth as well. One thing that we're seeing countries are not doing yet is this red box. So this basically refers to data. So KPIs is key performance indicators. And so while countries may be taking into account whether managers are doing this, they're not yet really doing so with firm data and indicators that can be tracked. It might be more of a subjective evaluation. So we would like to see countries move more towards the use of data, but of course it's a challenging thing to do. So this is maybe something that will be emerging over the coming years. Speaking of data, there is a potential greater use for it in all aspects of a learning and development strategy. So not just in performance evaluations, but in evaluating whether the learning and development strategies are working in the first place, which is a really difficult thing to do. And so that presentation we just heard about evaluation, I think he made it sound somewhat simple, but it's a very difficult thing to do, to go beyond, just an employee satisfaction survey and actually see if learning and development strategies are resulting in new skills that are not just learned, but are actually being used on the job, and then whether that is having a substantive effect in outcomes. It's very challenging. And so that was a really interesting presentation to hear. So when we asked countries what they are doing with their data and what data they're tracking to begin with, we weren't surprised to see that the most popular thing countries were doing are maybe the low-hanging fruit, the easy wins for data collection. So they're collecting data on the budget spent on training costs, the types of training being taken, employee satisfaction. So if they're doing a survey, it's usually that sort of thing. But this red box here is that we found most countries are not yet tracking, not usually because they don't want to, but because it's difficult and they don't know how. They're not tracking the effectiveness of the different types of training and learning, and they're not tracking whether new skills and knowledge are actually being used on the job. And another thing we found that they were not tracking are these yellow boxes that you can see on the screen, which is information on participation across different diverse groups of employees. So in this case, it's gender, age, disability, and different socioeconomic backgrounds. These are important to track because it's very important to make sure that learning and development opportunities are reaching everybody in the workforce and not just specific types of people. And there may be barriers or roadblocks that stop people from taking the training, whether they're not being identified for training in the first place, which is really important for the development of a leadership pipeline, but maybe there are opportunities being offered that simply aren't available to them because of other things that aren't being considered. So an example of this would be, we worked with a country that had a leadership development training, and they didn't kind of realize there was any problem with it until they tracked data and realized that most of the people signing up and taking this training were men. And they couldn't totally figure out why until they looked a bit deeper and then they thought about it. It was a country where, for the most part, women are still undertaking the majority of childcare duties, and the course was offered either in a different city, so they had to travel and stay overnight, or it was a weekend or evening thing, and women weren't able to take it up because they had childcare responsibilities. And so once they adjust the timing and the location of the training, it opened up the opportunities for more women to attend it. But they could only do that because they tracked the data to begin with and realized there was a problem. This slide goes a bit more into the learning tools, and it's focusing on these yellow arrows, which is the online tools. So this whole slide shows what schools of government are doing in terms of different types of modules and different tools that they're using. But we wanted to focus on how much countries were taking advantage of technology that's available. So we weren't surprised to see that the most popular thing schools are doing is offering online training modules and classes, and they have online platforms and self-directed online modules. That's kind of this cluster of yellow arrows that's at the top. But then there's that second cluster of yellow arrows that show kind of the next step of using digital technology that's not being used yet. So gamified learning, mobile learning apps, and AI-based learning systems. Most countries are not taking these into account. Just over 10% in most cases either have it or are planning to use it maybe in the future. A lot of countries are looking at how they might be able to do it, but it's something that takes a lot of investment and planning and a real commitment to do. So there are a couple of countries that are really emerging as leaders in this, and I'll mention that at the end. But it's something that probably offers a lot more potential going forward. This slide focuses on informal learning. So especially for adults and especially in the workplace, a lot of the research shows that the majority of learning happens almost without an intent. So it happens by observing others doing things. It happens by watching your immediate manager and how they do their job. It happens by just trying things out and maybe not getting it right the first time, but then learning how to do it. This is probably where 80% of learning takes place, especially for adults. And so being able to incorporate informal learning into a learning plan is a really important thing that would probably unleash a lot of potential for governments to instill these competencies and behaviors that aren't that possible to teach in a classroom. You can't have a class and just tell people, be more resilient, manage change better. You can give them the skills to try to do it, but informally is where they learn to actually roll out a lot of what they've learned. But the positive thing that we found was that a lot of countries are doing this without really realizing that they're doing it. So that's this green box that shows the dark blue and the gray bars on the chart. So the dark blue is that, they're doing these things and they're doing it intentionally to enable learning on the job. And then there's the gray that is basically like, oh, we actually are doing this, but I didn't really think about it that way. But if we could incorporate it into a learning plan, we could probably harness the potential of that and make a big difference. So this was actually really encouraging that some things like designing work around teamwork or having networks and communities of practice to share experiences are already happening, and that they could be scaled up in a really effective way. And even the things that were not happening as much, this bottom one is having specific tools to promote the sharing of learning from failures and reflect on failures. A lot of countries are still doing it, more than about 60%. So this could be scaled up in a way that's really effective in a school of government or in a government's learning and development systems. Here are some of the examples of other countries and what they're doing. So I think that this might be a bit helpful for comparison. The United Kingdom, they dissolved their school. They had an official school of government, but they dissolved it years ago. And now they're working on a new initiative that really isn't an official school of government, but it's bringing all of the training and learning opportunities from across the entire government under one umbrella. And they're calling it the government campus curriculum. And they're really scaling it up. It's not a physical school, although they have physical buildings. But say, for an example, that one ministry has a really effective training that's only being offered to people in that ministry, but it's a great training. They're bringing everything under one umbrella. A lot of it is online and making it available to everybody across the government to try to be more effective with the resources that they have. South Korea is a country that is really leading the way in e-learning and using those digital tools that I was talking about. They are piloting a new e-learning platform that is really expansive, and it has a lot of micro learning content. So some things will be 30 seconds, 1 minute long videos. They have chat rooms. They have ways for people to talk about what they've learned. And another thing that they're doing is they're letting employees become the content creators. So if there's somebody who is really, really good at one specific skill or knows one system really well, they can create a video, a minute, 2 minutes, and upload it. And then they also kind of get points for doing that. So it creates incentives within the system to learn and also help other people learn. Ireland has their own dedicated school of government, and they also are developing this online learning platform that they call One Learning. So they use their existing school for a lot of the more formal courses, and then they're using this platform that they're developing for maybe more specific, interactive, a broader expanse of scope, learning and development opportunities. Italy is a country that we work a lot with. They have a dedicated school of government. Our network of school of government, the annual meeting this year is going to happen at that school of government. So we work quite closely with them. The School of Government has a big academic curriculum, and they also work with ministries to develop and recruit on competencies. So they teach civil servants once they're in, but they are also helping to develop competency frameworks to try to identify the types of skills that should be recruited for, and that can also be developed once people are in order to kind of close that gap between identifying the skills and when training can take place, to streamline it a bit, because Italy is hiring a lot of people. They have on average, older workforce, and so a lot of people are retiring, and recruitment is really turning up there. So it's a really important initiative there. Brazil is maybe a country that's a bit more comparable. They have their school, National School of Government also, who ran that survey for us, and they're going through a lot of reforms in their learning and development systems and in their school, thinking really specifically about roles in the public service and the skills that are needed. And they've also developed innovation labs to try to increase innovation skills in that sort of informal learning way. So they found that it's more effective to actually bring people into a lab and have them go through the motions of doing these innovative things rather than just teaching what it might take to be innovative. So a lot of this data that I've told you is going to come out in a report that should be published next month. And when it does get published, it will go onto our iLibrary. The passwords for that are at the top. People who are part of central government sometimes have automatic access, but if you don't and you're interested, that password that's at the top right now will get you access to everything that's in the OECD iLibrary. So it's our stuff, but it's also everything else that the OECD puts out. So I'll leave that on the screen for a little bit, and then you can write it down if you'd like. But our websites for the kind of work we do are also at the bottom there for public employment and management, as well as the schools of government. And of course, you can always email me if you have any other questions or if there's data you're after, and I'd be happy to help if I can.
Thank you so much, Alana. Thank you for joining us on our very important event. We do appreciate you taking the time to share that quite interesting findings in some cases with us in terms of the study. I see that some people are posting some questions in the Q&A, so I'm going to ask Mr. Stephen Meaty to just do his presentation. So if you do want to answer some of those questions sort of on the back burner, you're welcome to do so. So to just introduce Stephen Meaty, I just want to say that we've been in government together for a very long time, and we've eaten many bags of soap. Soap, that's a Freudian slip. Sold together, being public servants for so long. Mr. Miti is the Chief Director for People Training and Empowerment in the Department of the Premier in the Western Cape. His responsibilities include heading the Provincial Training Institute, administering bursaries and internships across the 11 provincial departments. In 2000, the provincial government started with the process to reconfigure the Training Institute. And Mr. Miti is here to share his experience of this process up to now with us. Thank you so much, Stephen. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Soraya. And thanks for inviting me to this PSTF webinar that I regard as important for education, training and development professionalization, which is the theme for this webinar. Good morning to all the guests and the colleagues who are on this platform. My presentation will be on the repositioning of academies for professionalization. And as Soraya said, I will provide a case study on the reconfiguration of the Western Cape Provincial Training Institute, or as we call it, the PTI. So whenever I talk about the PTI, I would be referring to the Western Cape Provincial Training Institute. I'll put up my slides, my presentation now. Can you see the presentation, Soraya?
We can just put it in presentation mode, slide mode.
I'll do so. Is it
That's
in
perfect.
presentation
Thank
mode
you.
now? Okay. What I actually want to do is I actually want to stop the video so that the quality is better. I will put it on towards the end. Colleagues, in the interest of time, I will talk to most of the slides, which will be made available to you to go through at your leisure. I will briefly then talk about, I am trying to move my slides. Right. I will talk about the global challenges that we're facing, all of us, and what the Western Cape government strategic response has been. I will then also provide some strategic reasons for the reconfiguration of the PTI and take you through the journey we have traveled thus far. I'll then share the PTI's new operating model and indicate what will be different going forward. And then lastly, I will share an implementation roadmap and some of the low-hanging fruit that we have identified. Now, colleagues, we have a range of, we all experience a range of global and national and local crises. Some of these conflict and war, environmental, ecological damage, health issues, poverty, unemployment and inequality, and technological disruption. We all face these crises. Now, the question is, how do we leverage off the technological advances and the challenges that we are facing? How do we leverage from the fourth industrial revolution, the fifth industrial revolution in a 21st century world? And then lastly, I just want to highlight the impact that COVID-19 has had on all of us. Now, COVID-19 has reshaped the lives and revealed a lot of societal dysfunction. The United Nations has defined COVID not only as a health crisis, but also as an economic, security, humanitarian, and human rights crisis. Now, how do we respond to these challenges? Now, the 21st century facing leadership, it cannot be business as usual with all of these challenges that are facing us. We need a totally different operating model for a system of government that was designed in the 1990s and is now clearly out of date and not suitable to address the challenges of a post-COVID and 21st century world. And lastly, I just want to say the leadership of the Western Cape then decided in order to, face these challenges head on, it was time perhaps to reset, to reconfigure, and to refresh. Now, this is the, the context in which the Provincial Training Institute was reconfigured. Now, some strategic context, just to share with you. The reconfiguration of the PTI was done within the context of the Provincial Strategic Implementation Plan, its vision, and strategic priorities. The vision of the Western Cape is building a government that people trust. And I think Elana referred earlier on to a government must be trusted. So the vision of the Western Cape is to build a government that people trust. Everything that we do is done to achieve this vision. Everything we do is done around this vision. There are 3 strategic priorities, namely growth for jobs, safety, as well as well-being. And all of this is underpinned by innovation, a developmental culture, and good governance. What were some of the strategic reasons? Why did we have to reconfigure? Now, an academy or institution of learning must remain relevant and future-oriented. Otherwise, you risk you stand the risk of becoming obsolete. And so in order to remain relevant and future-oriented, we had to reconfigure ourselves. Now, this is in line with the professionalization of the public service, the public servants, and the pursuit of a transformed professional, ethical, capable, and developmental public sector. As I said earlier on, it cannot be business as usual. There is a need then. The objective is to modernize the institute into a learning and innovation learning center that will contribute to a citizen-centric, innovative, and integrated service delivery to the citizens, thereby supporting the strategic intent of a progressive and innovation-focused government. The citizens, we have now decided that our operating model will include citizens as an important stakeholder, if not the most important stakeholder. That is why we're talking of a citizen-centric government. Now, the reconfiguration journey so far, what have we done? Now, the management and staff of the Institute decided in 2000, as Soraya said, to develop a draft model for reconfiguration of the Provincial Training Institute, and we tabled this to the provincial leadership. The draft model was then formed a solid base for the development of the final reconfiguration model. We partnered with Ernst & Young for a period of 1 year to build a final operating model. There was extensive stakeholder consultation via a focus group system, both internally as well as externally, which also included the citizens. As I said, they are the most important stakeholder. And then the final operating model was tabled in December of 2022, and it will be implemented incrementally from 2023, 2024 going forward. Now, this is also part of our learning and development strategy. Elana, in one of the slides, there was a question of whether the Institute has a learning and development strategy. We decided that this was going to form part of our learning and developmental strategy. Now, the consultations that we had was quite vast. We had done 41 different engagement sessions attended by 450 people. 72 attendees attended more than one session, contributing to more than once to the thinking and co-creation of what we wanted to do. 146 key stakeholders across the organization and externally were also involved. Now, we do not only rely on WSPs and workforce plans to plan, but we meet with individual HODs to discuss their strategic training and developmental needs. So this was part of the engagement that we had. This is a busy slide that shows you the journey that we traveled. I will not go through it, but just highlight a few things. We kicked off with as I said earlier on, internal discussions, and then we met with the DG and all the HODs in the province to get the necessary mandate. And then the deliverables, the first one, when we appointed Ernst & Young, was to, the deliverable number one was an amended and enhanced desired future state. We wanted to know what is the future state of the Provincial Training Institute. The second deliverable was to do a gap analysis to see what do we want to achieve, but what are the gaps currently. And the third deliverable was to come up with an amended and enhanced reconfigured PTI model. And then going forward, the next deliverable was, just a minute, was an amended and enhanced reconfigured model. And the next one was, just a minute, I'm trying to move my slides. The next deliverable was an amended and enhanced implementation roadmap. And the last one was an implementation report. Now, this is the job that Ernst & Young, that we actually asked them to assist us with. Now, this is the model that we came up with. I know it's a very busy slide, but I'm just going to dissect it a bit for you. The first one is the vision that we want for the Provincial Training Institute is to be a world-leading hub for public sector learning, development, and innovation. The mission to create an enabling condition for learning and development collaborations and interventions that catalyze innovative service delivery improvement. Then the mandate to provide learning, development, and innovation opportunities and solutions for the Western Cape towards public service delivery improvement by empowering the Western Cape government through knowledge, capability, partnerships, and space. Our main customer segments as a provincial academy is the Western Cape government, local government, as well as national department employees who are based within the Western Cape. Another customer segment is the higher education institution and other training institutes in the public and private sector, civic organizations, civil society, and the private sector, as well as Western Cape citizens. We do include them in our training programs. The core capabilities, it's a strategy and planning, innovation facilitation, learning design, digital platform and technologies, learning delivery, and facility management. And lastly, then, the enabling capabilities is partnership management, change management, knowledge management, people management, finance, legal, IT, and risk management. Now, this forms the new operating model for the Western Cape Training Institute. What will be different going forward? These what we have identified as our, the most important categories going forward is to establish an innovation center at the Training Institute, to have a curriculum refresh, to professionalize our trainers, our ETDPs. We're also looking at partnerships, stakeholder management, and collaboration. We're looking at a modernized and customized service delivery methods. And lastly, we're looking at our aesthetics, how the academy looks, and also at our digital infrastructure. I will quickly talk to each of those areas. As far as the Innovation Center is concerned, we want a place to connect, collaborate, and co-create solutions, a sandbox where people can make mistakes and learn, and just-in-time training for pre and post coal phase deployment, and we are using the Kaidu model, and also to enhance our research capacity, especially in partnership with universities or HEIs. Then the curriculum refresh. We are actually looking at developing a responsive and relevant curriculum to support the strategic intent of a government. We're looking at the content and the quality of the curriculum. As I said earlier on, we are talking to individual HODs to establish their strategic development and training needs as well. We're also looking at credit accumulation transfer in partnership with our universities, so that the institute or the academy becomes a work integrated learning site. And we want our academy to become the institution of choice for our constituencies, those areas that I mentioned earlier on, those constituents. Then the professionalizing of our trainers or our facilitators. We want to upskill them, especially for this virtual instructor-led training. We want them to be fit for purpose by mastering technology, multitasking effectively, fostering a comfortable learning environment, and also offering virtual facilitation courses. An example, we are currently doing the digital art of facilitation with the National School of Government. And we are also looking at, modern methods of engagement. Also, to become part of a professional body for facilitators, the NHG is spearheading this for us, and we welcome it greatly. Thanks, Faith Nyaka mentioned it earlier on, that ETDPs must belong to a professional body. That is one of our objectives as well. And then partnerships. We are partnering with our universities. We are looking at a comprehensive stakeholder echo mapping. We are also partnering with the universities to actually do public management courses with them. We know that the universities are, they've got the theoretical knowledge, but we have the practical knowledge. So some of our senior managers form partnership with the universities to share with the students who are doing public management about what we do in the public service. And so that is why we are partnering with our HEIs and the National School of Government and all of those other spheres. We want this to be a symbiotic and reciprocal value-adding relationship. Then modernized and customized delivery methods. I'm not going to go through those. Those are the methods that we are actually now introducing, and some of them have been around, but I'm not going to stay with that. We are also looking at how our academy looks, aspirational aesthetics and digital infrastructure. We are busy now redesigning our learning spaces, the landscaping and maintenance to establish an environment for a creative collaboration. The lecture and collaboration spaces, we are also redesigning. We are also, introducing or rather improving our ICT infrastructure, systems and network, and we are having committed ICT support as well. Now, these are just some of the pictures for how we want our academy to look like. But then, going forward, colleagues, the implementation map going
Mr. Meaty, we've seemed to have lost sound. Colleagues, we will communicate with Mr. Meaty directly and try and get him back for him to just finalize his presentation. Can I just ask the Secretariat to check with him, maybe to also stop sharing his presentation, then we can use the available time to just check some of the questions and comments that were made. We have on the Q&A session, Karen, you made a very valid point that we do actually focus on training the public servants after they leave the school environment, but it might be more important for us to also start focusing on the back to basics of the morals and the values, which must be addressed on early childhood development level. And only once we get that right, will we be able to actually change everything around. Then Bryce, you opened the can of worms around the impact of artificial intelligence and the impact that that will have on everything that we are being involved with. We at the NSG is very much aware of the implications of that. We have put together a small study group to start looking into this, but it is a very complex environment in terms of what needs to be done. There is a question to Mr. Miti around whether they have a framework for the implementation and the return on investment. Can I just check, Stephen, are you back with us?
Yes, I am back. I'm sorry, I had some challenges there.
Okay, so perhaps I'm not sure how far you were in your presentation.
I'm not sure where I'm not sure where you lost me, but I was about to finish.
Okay, maybe just let me just allow you to wrap up, and then we'll go to the question and answers. Thank you.
Okay. Colleagues, we have identified these priority areas. I'm not sure whether you lost me at this stage, but these are the priority areas that we have identified. Stakeholder and partner eco-mapping. We are establishing an innovation hub or facility at the academy. We will look at innovative methodologies integrated in service delivery model. We will rethink and refresh our entire curriculum. We are redesigning the campus. We will look at research through thought leadership. We are also working with our universities to enhance our research capacity. We are upskilling our PTI leadership and facilitators. We're looking at change management strategy, institutional arrangements, and also the idea of marketing. And then we have now established these cross-functional work groups to assist us with those. And then lastly, these are the low-hanging fruit that we have identified. I'm not going to go through them. Suite of innovative methodologies is one of them. Leadership, development of a leadership pipeline is another area that we are looking at. Learning management system, and we have already installed an online booking system for our academy. Lastly, colleagues, the reconfiguration has been a developmental and exciting journey. It is our conviction that this body of work will contribute positively towards creating a government that people trust, which is the vision of our government. I just want to end off with these words, that there is no shame in not knowing, the shame lies in not finding out. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Miti. I'm just quickly browsing through the questions. There is one question from Lasiba around the framework for implementation of return on training investment model, whether you have any documentation on that. Perhaps you can just respond verbally to that one, and then you can take that forward.
Okay, we do have, as I said, a training and development strategy for the province. Not a return on investment as such, but a return on service. We do surveys from time to time with our employees. We do surveys with the citizens. So we are more looking at a return on service rather than a return on investment. We don't want to use the economic language, but our strategy does contain those. I don't know if I have answered Lisiba. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I want to just also highlight the comment made by Caiphus in terms of the professionalization of leaders and managers, that it has been in existence for quite some time, and that we seem to not getting the service delivery and irregularities right in terms of that. He makes the point training can be a solution and may not be a solution, and then asks the question, how best can this be addressed to improve competency, ethics, and moral values? I think the day that we get that right would be a wonderful day for the public service. We are putting in place a number of training interventions on that, but I think this links to the comment that Karen made in the Q&A session, that we will only be able to really make a change once we start addressing this on the foundation education level. Thank you. I think in the interest of time, I'm going to move on, and I'm going to ask Ms. Denise Miller to take us through the professionalization framework and the implications there are. Denise, I'm not sure if you have a presentation. Now, I asked Dr. Miller for some pointers, so she must just live with what I have to say. We have been colleagues for a long time in the NSG, and I have certainly learned a lot from her in terms of the responsibilities that lie on her side, but actually then moves over to where my responsibilities lie. Denise, thank you so much. Perhaps you can say a few words of introduction about yourself before you start with your presentation. Thank you.
No, thank you very much, Surya. My job is just to come to the PSTF to remind them that we have done quite a bit of consultation in 2021 around the development of the professionalization of ETD practitioners. And I know at that stage, my predecessor, Dr. Muthian, and my colleague, Dr. Shezi, who has retired since at the end of last year, they have done extensive work with some of the participants on today's platform with regard to the framework. And I just thought it would be good if we share where we are at now. So if I can just move my slides. So colleagues, as you know that we have done, as I already said, we've consulted with many of you around how would an ETD, a professional ETD practitioner perform like, and the characteristics that we would assign to such a position. And you have given us valuable inputs, and even today we are taking the conversation further, and especially around the questions that have been posed by Baroka and Nosisa around how do we begin to look at the gap between what we do as ETD practitioners and what is actually happening in practice in our different departments and our institutions. So currently, we're at the space where we are beginning to take small steps around building a ETD practitioner professionalization system within the National School of Government. Just to remind us again, these were the sessions that were held in Limpopo, Northwest, as well as we've had an opportunity to have consultations in the 22nd Annual Public Sector Trainer Forum. The rationale for this particular framework was for us to begin to question for ourselves what is our role in supporting professionalization of the public sector. And to be honest with you, I think we were spearheading the whole conversation of the national professionalization framework already. And as Prof. Masamremule reminded us, ETD practitioners, we have a key role to play in instilling and institutionalizing professionalization or professionalism in the system. So for us, colleagues, we understand it when we looked at all your comments the comments led us to understand that when we look at our own role as ETD practitioners, that we have to play a role in recruitment and selection, and that's why Pillar 1 is there, as Faith has already indicated. We looked at development and certification, so not everybody can teach or facilitate or do development work within the system, but we need to look at how do we certificate people, and then obviously once we deploy the individual to work within the system as a ETD practitioner, we have to look at performance and monitoring. I'm not going to go through this, so we are talking about recruitment, then we're going into professionalization, and finally we are beginning to look at continuous performance management, and particularly colleagues that we as coordinators of ETD interventions in the system, we have to make sure that the quality of those ETD interventions are good. Then just the last bit that I thought that I need to share with colleagues, as Mr. Mitu already also indicated, we have done this bit already. Because we know that most of us, if not all, we make use of external ETD practitioners for us, and so we do go through the whole process of having a proper contractual agreement with the individual so that we can hold that individual accountable. And so we have started in the school with our initial practitioner professionalization, and that's why I would encourage you to come tomorrow to the session, because Dr. Vreiling will expand on how this particular intervention looks like and how we are doing it currently. And we will also encourage some participants on that program to share with you their experiences. And we are now beginning to look forward to the initial deployment of the ETD practitioners that have been on our Art of Facilitation program. So essentially, when we talk about our professionalization interventions currently, and we are working on that, colleagues, so that the system will expand. We're looking at the ETD practitioners participating in the Art of Facilitation, and already, as Alana has said, and as Stephen has concluded, as well as Joss has indicated, that we need to look at how do we use ICT as in facilitating learning, but also facilitating development in the system so that it is scalable and that it is not elitist in the way that we deliver this. So we're also looking currently at how we develop assessors, again, that we can also assess online as well as moderators, but it's also about how we connect that to specific onboarding initiatives in the department. Those were also questions because in the chat already, or the Q&A, around how do we create an enabling environment for the transfer of learning in the workplace. And then just lastly, I wanted to share, currently when we look at our ETD practitioners in the school, we have 6 categories from which we are drawing, and many of the people that we have had working relationships in the past, we will be coming and having conversations with you around participating in this particular program, and even expanding the program in establishing your own programs. Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to share that, and I wanted to just extend the school's appreciation to all of those participants that have contributed to the establishment of the framework, and we are now looking at how do we actually realize that framework into a practice. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Dr. Miller, for that brief overview of the professionalization framework. I am noting the request for the service model to be shared via email, and I think that is aimed at Mr. Miti, if you can just take note of that. Then there is a comment on the succession planning and the reflection. And I'm going to read from the comments. It would be really great if we can be assisted with the implementation mechanisms that would not be subject to criticism of biases and favoritism by union reps. Now, I have a lot of sympathy with regard to the statement there. We as the NSG could certainly look into assisting with that one. So taking note of that. Then there's a comment with regard to RPL and a question that it would help if we can get a list of HEIs that have been accredited to conduct RPL. There, I am not aware that any such a list exists within the NSG, but I do know that my colleague Faith Nyaka is working on issues around RPL, and that she may have access to that. So perhaps we can look into that and share that with you. Dr. Miller, I'm not sure if you have any more information regarding that last comment that was made.
With regard to the RPL, Chair?
Yes, please.
Faith will definitely expand, but I suppose she left already, Chair. That is definitely something that we are currently working on. And I think, as Stephen already indicated, we have to look at the integration of and transfer of learning from one institution into another institution, and how we can continue with that. And it is certainly something that is on our radar at the moment. And therefore, I think it would be important for us, and Stephen, you can come in now. It would be important for us to take cognizance of Joseph's presentation, because it then means that we have to be quite clear, how do we set up our delivery of our training so that we can measure that and make sure that we have a clear theory of change and clear indicators, a set of indicators that we can then make an argument for that integration. Stephen, would you like to continue on that?
Yes, please. Thanks, ma'am. The RPL, one of the institutions we work with very closely, and they've got a very good RPL program, fully fledged program. It's the Cape Peninsula University of Technology. They've got a very good RPL program, and we work with them. Other universities within the Western Cape, they do have it. We also work with the Cape Higher Education Consortium. But what I'll do is I will forward the particulars of the director at the Cape Peninsula University of Technology to you guys, and then you can engage with her. They've got a very good program, and we are actually working with them. Thank you.
Thank you for pointing us in the right direction, Mr. Meaty. We are running out of time. According to my clock, there's 1 minute to go. So in the interest of the 3 hours that we've already taken from you, I would like to just thank all of you for registering for today's session, for participating, for listening. And I want to encourage you, if you have not done it, to join us again for tomorrow's meeting. It's different topics that we are going to be discussing. As I indicated, we're going to focus on ICT tomorrow and the implications of that. Then I want to thank all of the speakers for contributing to the session, even those in absentia. Some people had to already leave. Thank you for that. But as I said, most importantly, I want to thank everyone that attended the session and participated and shared their thoughts on the Q&A session. I'm looking forward to being with you in the session tomorrow. Be safe and have a wonderful day further. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Sarira. Thanks. Bye.
Secretariat, you can stop the streaming and the recording.